Hello you dirty potters, how are you today? Today we're going to talk about a texture that I've been a little bit obsessed with as of late. Today we're going to talk about the crater texture. I don't know if that is what it is called in the pottery world, but I do know that this texture looks like a bunch of these stuck together in close proximity, and because this looks like a crater, I've been calling it the crater texture, and no one's argued with me, so I guess that's what it's called now. The crater texture is pretty easy to do with any clay body that is in the leather-ish phase, and you can do it with your normal pear trim tool that you get in your beginner's package. This trim tool rather, comes with most beginner packages, and a lot of people learn to trim with it, including myself when they first learned how to trim. Although I will say for this specific purpose that I did buy a brand new trim tool that looks just like this. This is pretty much the same thing. The main thing is that your trim tool should have some sort of large rounded edge. I say large because some people are going to make super small craters with this tool right here. This is fine too, but for this specific texture, I'm using a larger pattern. This is also what I consider an intermediate video, so by the time you get here, you should already know how to do your base shapes, because I won't be explaining that today. If you want to know some more of the base shapes, you can go to my beginner playlist, but for now, we're going to start off with a regular old mug shape, because I assume, after the beginner phase, that most of you already know how to make your mugs. So let's get started. Potter tip! If you're planning to try this texture out and you're throwing a fresh new pot, I heavily suggest you do either one less pull, or if you're experienced enough, you make your clay body a little bit thicker than you normally would. Because of this, I usually pull about 2 times to make a mug, especially a thinner mug, but I'm only going to be pulling 1 time for this technique. This is because we are essentially going to be carving through the clay body with our trim tool, and because of that, you don't want to go through the clay body as you're carving it. So if you can help it, or if you have the experience to, make sure you make your clay body a little tiny bit thicker. It goes a long way when you're carving later on. The high majority of this technique is really just making the mug by itself. The texture comes later when it's in the leather phase. So by this point, you're essentially done. You really just need to make your mug, take it off, wrap it up, and let it slow dry until you decide to put the handle on it, if that's what you're deciding to make.
Extra thick!
If this is your first time making this texture, it's a good idea to make a couple of them. I made about 20 of these over the weekend when I got a little bit obsessed with them, and I ruined about 3 carving through the body because I'm naturally an aggressive puller, which means I have a little bit of a thinner clay body. So we're gonna make a couple more.
One eternity later.
Okay, it's been about a day, and I'm pretty sure these are dry enough. Good to go. This is the point where you need to decide whether you want to trim these or not, because if we decide to carve the texture through these before we trim them, the clay body might be a little bit weaker than if we did it the other way around. You are technically going to be taking chunks of clay out of this, and if you turn this around, decide to center it, trim a little bit, you might trim through the body, as you will be taking about 1/3 of the clay body off anyway when you do this texture. So if you're gonna trim them, I suggest you do that now, but then again, that's your choice, that's your prerogative, that's up to you. I, however, am going to trim mine because my mother raised me correctly. At this point, you're essentially done with everything except for the texture itself. And keep in mind, this is now in the leather phase. It's been air drying enough for me to still make marks in it, but not exactly go through the clay body, or I can also handle it fairly roughly without actually squishing it. At this point, all you do is get that rounded tool I noted to you earlier and start making your texture. Potter tip! Look, there's two things that I want to tell you. Number one, I've done it with this tool before. I hate this tool. It makes my stuff look like little tiny teardrops, and nobody likes that. That doesn't look like a crater at all. To be honest with you, if you wanted to make small dots on your work, which is kind of what a crater is, it's just a super big dot versus a smaller one, go ahead, please do it. But number one, it's gonna look like little tiny polka dots everywhere, which is not what we're trying to do in this video. And number two, you're going to be increasing your workload double if not triple, because you have to do double if not triple the work to cover the entire surface of your work. So in this one, I heavily suggest you get a rounded tool that's larger than this thing right here. At this point, you want to take your larger rounded trim tool and start swiping at the clay body. You dig in a little bit and you swipe in one direction. Dig in a little bit from that same point and you swipe in another direction. And you essentially keep doing this. You can even make a little pattern out of it. The key thing here is that you want to start from the last position that you came from, and you want to go in a bit of a pattern. You don't have to make an actual pattern, but you want to make sure you start from your last position, and just keep going until you cover the entire space. I'm very fond of holding my thumb as close as I can to the blade and just swiping away in one direction, making a really nice clean cut. As for the other ones, if I hesitate whatsoever or I start to like slowly pull, it ends up making this kind of weird swipey texture, which is a little counterintuitive because I am swiping, but it doesn't really make that texture if I swipe fast enough. It looks a bit more round than this texture here, which looks a bit more like a pull or a streak. What I'm going for here is to get it as round as I can while still connecting to the other craters. At the end of your texture adventure, it would be a good idea to kind of wipe it down with a wet sponge. See these little divots and whatnot right here? These little boogers, if you will, that are left on the clay body? These can very easily be taken off if you just wipe them down and either integrate them into the clay body or just simply wipe them away if they come off, if you're carving and your stuff's a little bit more leather hard. It also makes everything seem a little bit more streamlined and fluid as far as your texture goes. You see, these look a little bit hard, and this over here where I just wiped looks a little bit softer. That's a personal decision. If you want to do that, you can. If you don't want to do that, you don't have to. But this is a wiped surface, especially with leather clay, and this is a non-wiped surface. This looks a small bit more rigid and hard because it's unwiped. As for this texture here, it looks a bit smoother. Potter tip! If you didn't take my words into consideration earlier about making your clay body a little bit thicker, this is essentially what's going to happen to you if you decide to carve a little bit too deep. You're going to have to do some of this right here, where you carve a little too deep as you're making these. Okay, well, I made mine thick enough, so it didn't happen on the first swipe. It's okay. I might be a little bit too good at my job. All right. If you didn't heed my words earlier about making your clay body a little bit thicker than normal, you're essentially going to end up doing one of these, where you dig your way into the clay body as you make your crater, and you're going to essentially ruin your mug. At this point, you have one of two options. You can try and patch it back up with your fingers, but, you know, sometimes it doesn't work. The clay falls out, or the mug is a little too big to fit your fingers in there, and it's honestly just a hassle. This could have been circumvented by you just making your mug a little thicker and starting to pull off when you start carving in the first place, a little bit like this. This is also a giant hassle because at this point I could probably fix this, But if it's any more dry than it is now, it's gonna be a little bit harder to patch this up with anything. If I have something in the leather hard phase or even the bone dry phase, it's almost impossible without maybe some vinegar or some clay of the same type and a lot of time and slow drying. It's just something that should be avoided altogether. This will probably happen to you a couple of times while you try this technique. If this happens to you, remember the next time you prepare for this technique to make your clay a little bit thicker when you throw it. Other than that, the learning curve is essentially deciding how hard you're gonna press and how quickly you're gonna swipe as you decide to make this texture. The harder you press, the deeper you go, and the quicker you swipe, the more you might end up kind of morphing the clay body, especially if it's way softer. All right, buddy, I'm sorry, you have to go now. I used you in an example and you now have to die.
Do it then. Kill me.
One more thing before I go, and I feel like this should be a little bit obvious. You do not have to follow my pattern of making this texture all over one cup. You can very easily make your own pattern. I've seen someone do it before and I thought it was really good. I saw someone draw the boundary in between what they wanted to do and what they didn't want to do, and they just kind of carved like this, and they kept going up and up and up and up, while leaving the rest of the clay body nice and clean. This made a beautiful contrast, and I saw this side glazed and this side was not glazed. But do keep in mind that just because I show you something on a video doesn't mean you have to follow my instructions exactly. I'm just giving you the tools on your tool belt to build the house. How the house is built is up to you. Well, thank you, Dirty Potters, for joining me today. I know it seems like I just showed you how to make patternized dots in your clay body, and you're like, oh, this looks kind of easy. Trust me, when you first try this out, it is definitely a bit of a learning curve. Getting this texture down by itself cost me about 20 mugs to figure out which one I like, how to swipe, how deep, how much pressure to put, all of that jazz. I know it seems like I just gave you a tool and told you to make little holes in your clay body that connect to each other to make it look cool sooner or later, like little craters. But trust me, this takes much more of a learning curve than you might think it does. Pottery has a really bad habit of making itself look very easy to do and produce on a very basic level. This texture alone took about 10 mugs or so for me to figure out how deep I want the texture to go, how hard I'm gonna press, where I'm gonna swipe, either left, down, up, or right, what it looks like when you do down, left, down, up, or right, because if you do different swipes in different directions, it does look a bit different, how close I wanted the swipes to be together, how much pressure. It took a lot of trial and error and a bit more of a learning curve than it looks like it is on camera. So trust me, this is a really cool texture, but learning it takes a bit more practice than you might think. But thank you, Potters, for joining me today. Remember to click all the YouTube buttons so my YouTube overlords don't shove handfuls of clay into my mouth, and I will see you, Dirty Potters, next week.
Thank you for your patronage.
The best or maybe worst part of this technique is after you're done, you get clay confetti. Yay! I mean, parents call it a mess, but I just call it confetti.